from the narrow point of penetration. The shock of the advance required a high level of artillery support at the point of attack, and also harnessed the extra power of air interdiction. But in the 1930s, the bulk of Germany's heavy artillery forces was still horse-drawn. What this meant was that the advancing tanks and motorized infantry would rapidly outstrip the artillery support. Even mechanized prime movers like these half-tracks had their disadvantages. Time taken to move into position and deploy the guns for action under battlefield conditions meant vital time was lost. In battle, split seconds literally meant the difference between life and death.
The Blitzkrieg depended on several elements working in conjunction with each other. One was air support given by the Luftwaffe in the form of things like dive bombers, the Ju-87. And the other thing was artillery support. But one of the things about artillery in the German army during the Blitzkrieg era was that that was mainly direct fire artillery, that they were going after point targets because the Air Force was taking out also point targets. So they didn't have the communications equipment down on the lower levels to bring in massive amounts of artillery. In fact, the Germans never do develop that during World War II. Nor do any other armies except for the American Army.
If artillery was to play a real role in the new mobile warfare, it needed to be able to operate as close to the battle zone as possible. But the closer artillery pieces got to the action, the more vulnerable the gunners were to enemy fire. What was needed was an assault gun, a mobile artillery piece which could keep pace with the mechanized infantry, afford the gunners a measure of protection, and provide support on the battlefield at short notice, where it really mattered, in the very front line. A fully armoured and fully tracked mobile gun platform therefore had great appeal from the point of view of both mobility and crew protection. It also provided a means of providing close artillery support fire right in the very front line. Orders were dispatched for prototype vehicles. The successful prototype was produced in 1936 by the Olcott Company. The final vehicle was actually constructed from two separate elements, and it mounted a heavy 75mm gun on a Panzer III tank chassis. The 75mm was a heavier weapon than could normally be carried on a Panzer III, but the extra space for the heavier gun was achieved by dispensing with the turret and setting the gun on a fixed mount with a limited traverse. The Sturmgeschütz was born.
These are vehicles called Stug. They're the chassis of the Panzerkampfwagen Mark III. And when the Germans realized that the Panzer III was obsolete on the battlefield, they took the turrets off and installed these weapons up on the chassis. The one here in the foreground has a 105mm gun and is mobile artillery in effect. And the one in the background has a 75mm gun and is an anti-tank weapon. Both of them were very effective vehicles on the battlefield.
Naturally, the grenadiers fighting in the front lines welcomed this development with open arms. Here was an artillery piece which could fight with the infantry at the crucial point of the battlefield and move at their pace. Throughout the long years of World War II, the Sturmgeschütz crews never came to regard themselves as tank men. They wore different uniforms and still considered themselves to be artillerymen who happened to man mobile assault guns. But they were still gunners at heart.
Who commands them? The tank crews, the tank chaps said there are guns, and the artillery said no, there are guns. And I think, and I rather know, that each side in each army, each one had their favourites, as it were. But it depended what the tactical task was. The Wehrmacht had to discover the relationship between their self-propelled anti-tank artillery, their armour, and then specialised self-propelled artillery doing various kinds of jobs.
From the gunners' point of view, they quickly grew to love the Sturmgeschütz. After all, they were now protected against direct infantry fire and felt themselves impervious to anything but direct artillery fire. The powerful 75mm gun meant they packed a real punch in the attack. The Sturmgeschütz had a crew of 4: the commander, driver, loader, and gunner. It soon became the proud boast of the Sturmgeschütz crews that their men were all volunteers, always ready to answer the infantryman's call to bring up the guns. The new assault gunners took to the role with great enthusiasm. Although the cramped interior of each Geschütz officially had room for only 44 rounds, the crews soon found that they could carry 90 rounds of ammunition by stacking extra rounds in layers on the floor of the vehicle. This meant the guns could stay in action for longer and continue to give their support to the infantry for longer periods. In the coming years, that would be a great advantage.
One of the things about the German army in World War II is that they're elastic in their tactics, and they're elastic in their doctrine as to how they do things. For instance, in the Stug, I forget how many rounds the thing carries right now, but they would stick as many rounds as they could get into the thing, and they would be awash in rounds inside that vehicle. And the vehicle is not very roomy to start with, but they found very, very innovative ways to stick rounds into the vehicle.
Despite the early signs of promise, these first machines were produced in small numbers, and only 30 Geschützes were available for the French campaign of 1940. But they acquitted themselves well in their first actions. Orders were immediately given for the production of a further 500 machines. These machines equipped the first Sturmgeschütz batteries which served in the Blitzkrieg campaigns through the Balkans and into Russia.
It's not going to fight like a tank in the normal sense. It's not going to get into direct assault action. It's going to support the tank by bringing in wider natures of firepower, more high explosive and that kind of thing. The great advantage of a self-propelled gun is that you can get a larger gun onto a given chassis than you could if it was in a turret. And you do that, as in the case of the machine behind me, by putting a 75mm gun into a fixed superstructure on the tank, where in a gun tank you'd probably get no more than a 50mm gun onto the same chassis.
Initially, Sturmgeschützes were organized into independent battalions. Each battalion was composed of 3 troops, which originally had 6 guns each. The commander of the battalion also had his own vehicle. In later years, the number of vehicles in each troop was raised to 10, and the battalions were renamed as brigades, which in theory fielded 31 Sturmgeschütz. In practice, these ideals were hardly ever achieved, and then only highly favored formations received the full complement. In battle, these independent brigades were then allocated to support infantry formations for a specific action, and came under the command of the infantry they were ordered to support. As the war grew, the Sturmgeschütz commanders naturally gained a wealth of battle experience, gained from almost constant exposure to action. So in practice, it was frequently the infantry commanders who took the lead from the more experienced assault gun leaders. The official regulations stressed that the Sturmgeschütz should be employed en masse, but the constant demands of a terrible war meant that they were more often employed as single battalions, or even single machines. One shortcoming of the early Sturmgeschütz was the lack of a machine gun for close support against enemy infantry. A number of Sturmgeschütz had been lost to Russian infantry, which could have been avoided if the crew had had the means to fire back at close range.
One of the things that both tanks and assault guns need is a machine gun. And in fact, one of the big mistakes the Germans make in World War II, they don't put a machine gun on it. Now, if you think about that for a little bit, Russian infantry learns real quick that they can